Hello, everyone. Very happy to have the entire crew here. We have an amazing set of people that we are going to have on this panel discussing space, the opportunities, particularly beyond orbit and out and beyond that into CIS Lunar, and then also China, the threat, and being able to really tie these two together. As I mentioned, my name is Josh Carlson. I'm author of Space Power Ascendant and also the managing editor for Dauntless, which is a magazine that examines space issues, and particularly we will look for brave and dauntless visions of what the future could be like, and look for good, well-researched papers to be able to document that for a expansive online audience. Joining me today, we have the lovely Namrata Goswami, who is joining us as one of our Chinese experts. We also have Jonathan Ward. Dr. Goswami and Pete Garrison recently wrote Scramble for the Skies. Jonathan Ward's book is China's Vision of Victory, which I think he did a very good job of documenting China's plans throughout the ages. Also joining me are Steve Kwast and Christopher Stone, both with extensive backgrounds in space. And then, as mentioned, Orson Scott Card, author of Ender's Game, and also joining us for this panel as a futurist. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for joining me. If I could just do a quick sound check with you all to make sure that we're all good.
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Hello, Josh. Nice to be here.
Hello.
Outstanding.
And I'm
okay. So, I'm sorry. Say again.
No, you're fine.
Outstanding. Okay. Oh, good. So, hey, we've got a lot to cover, a lot of big brains, and trying to just jump right in. So, the previous panel was discussing orbital space and the importance of that, but beyond the orbits, maybe reshaping the question a bit. Beyond the orbits, why should we go to space? What do we hope to benefit from doing that, more than just necessarily exploration, or that might be part of it?
Yeah, I can start, since our book is called Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. So beyond just orbital investment, I think one of the reasons why countries like China are going to space is because of the economic potential of space, beyond just low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit. So they also talk about a concept called Earth-Moon space, which is interpreted as CIS Lunar space. So 3 reasons that why we need to go to space is because, first of all, there are resources in space, especially on the lunar surface, like iron ore, silicon, water ice that can sustain life. Second, the asteroid belt has resources like titanium, platinum. And finally, I think the final destination and desire and philosophical desire of humankind is to expand beyond the limits of their Earth habitat, right? And so these are some of the reasons why I think we need to go beyond the orbital dynamics into deep space.
Excellent. Thank you, Nami. Anyone else from the panel to have a different answer or highlight something else?
Not a different answer, it's just an augmentation, but there are a lot of us who have worried for many years about extinction level events, and would really like to have some representatives of the human race, preferably a very mixed group, that would survive something like that because they're already in space. But that also means that we need to have habitats, both orbiting and planet, asteroid, or moon-based, that can sustain themselves for a long period of time without having to be resupplied constantly from Earth. The less we have to take off from Earth and get out of that gravity well, the better it's going to be for all of us. The better the Space Force is going to be able to do its job. So getting a representative portion of our DNA off planet sounds really good to me.
I can add something, which is just in the context of the US-China competition, which is going to be the dominant geopolitical exercise of our lifetimes. we're badly in need of a new frontier. I mean, what's happened already is that China has essentially caught up to the United States in many of the economic domains that exist on Earth. And we're going to badly need to transform this contest into one that we can win, which means that we need new frontiers, new discoveries. And I think this, sort of capitalizes on something that America has got, which is a very powerful sense of imagination, a sense of discovery, and then the ability to go and execute on what we can design in terms of a way to win in space, and to use that as one of the key elements that allows us to transform the US-China competition. At the foundations of it, it is a contest for economic power. That's just true throughout history. The top economy tends to ultimately, as the Chinese Communist Party put it, shape world affairs. That's been our role for 100 years, and we need to secure that role, which means we need to basically make use of everything we can that's transformative. And this is one of them.
So I'll add one other point that hasn't already been punctuated, and that is that when you take a look at the human race as an economy over time, when you experience these secular slowdowns that we see globally right now, there is nothing more powerful for the prosperity and the health and the security of the human race than to expand the marketplace. So in many ways, in addition to the points that have been made, which I think are all very important, there is a blessing where we can use this expansion of economic benefit to solve some of the dilemmas terrestrially that we might be bumping up against and we see no way out. This will expand our turning room to solve problems for humanity that we could not solve within the terrestrial realm. That's a very important historical context when you take a look at civilizations and the journey of civilizations with one another over time. And if we do it right, if we abide by these principles that people are talking about with the rule of law and the respect for every human being in this economy, where entrepreneurs can make good risk decisions to provide novel and useful things to the human race, and we hold people accountable for behavior that's counter to these values, then we have a chance of actually increasing and uplifting the human condition in a positive way, as history has shown when you have these secular slowdowns and you can increase the economy. So there are massive muscle movements for the human race going on right in front of us now, and we are talking about some of the building blocks to make sure we do that well.
Perfect. If there's no further comments, we'll move on to the next question, because we've just talked about the importance of going to space. We've already kind of started to frame it in the context of China, but we're going to transition to a really direct conversation now about we've identified this as a amazing opportunity. Unfortunately, we are also not alone in that. The Chinese have also identified it. And so what are their plans in space, particularly looking at CIS Lunar, beyond?
I mean, I can start again. So, and since I work on China specifically, so I think if you want to understand the Chinese space program from a civilizational perspective, there are three very critical goals that they've identified for the next 25 years. One is that they have included space in their grand strategic concept of who they are. And this is a very fascinating shift in the last 7 years after President Xi Jinping came to power in 2013. So space is no more seen as a domain out there. It is seen as an intrinsic part of what China wants to become and a very critical part of their civilizational discourse. So one way you can empirically prove that is that if you listen to the speech that President Xi gave to the 20th Party Congress, he utilized the word national rejuvenation and civilizational greatness about 40 times, which is a real re-emphasis on Chinese civilizational greatness vis-a-vis the Western-led international order. The second reason, the Chinese long-term goal, and this is where the specifics come in, they are looking to establish a base on the moon by 2036 in collaboration with Russia. And the goal is not to send humans there, which is the American Artemis program. Their Chang'e mission's goal is to actually utilize their robotic capability, which was articulated by Wu Weiring, who's the chief designer of China's lunar mission, in an interview he gave to Oxford University, where he argued that the resources on the moon are going to add to the economic capability of China, but also create a possibility of launching from the moon with much less energy. So that's why the moon is of such strategic value. And the final goal, of course, is to go to deep space, but also to ensure that China has the leadership in articulating the rules of how you engage with space, as well as dominating the access to space, which is low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, and cislunar space. So these are some of the goals that they have identified through their speeches, white papers, as well as interviews given by their lead scientists.
I'll also throw in there, if you don't mind, on the space dominance piece, there is a military application of that, and that's obviously one of the areas that I focus on. And that is they not only want to reach out and to become a great space power, to be the leader of the international system, things of that sort. They also want to have space dominance from a standpoint of preventing others from having the access and the freedom of maneuver in space. So one of the other things that they're looking at beyond the robotic lunar base is the addition of maneuver advantage, or what they call mobile warfare advantage, in space, using everything from the weapon systems that they're already building deep magazines of, ASATs, counter space, directed energy, but also nuclear thermal propulsion type of vehicles that allow them to, on one tank of gas, if you will, be able to maneuver across orbits and out into cislunar space and back by around 2035. Currently, the United States has the ability to do that. They've had it for quite some time, and they're working on some programs at DARPA and other areas. But having that ability to go where they need to in a quick amount of time, instead of taking days or weeks or even hours to get there, on propellant that can be depleted and thereby impacting lifespan, is something that will be really a big game changer for them. And I think that the United States should be looking at that as a way to counter, if we want to maintain the leadership role, to advance the values that we see fit, as well as having the ability to have space superiority in case of conflict, which, as we've seen throughout history, as economic power and economic and commerce expands into different frontiers, to use Jonathan's term, obviously conflict will follow. And if we want to maintain the ability to defend our interests, we need to have a space force capable of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely true. I think just to add to this, the point about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is the guiding sort of overarching concept in the whole hierarchy of CCP thinking. And it's really not Xi Jinping's original idea. I mean, it originated in the 90s, and even before that, Mao Zedong in the New China. I mean, this is a mission, and Xi Jinping calls it a mission and talks about its importance. And this is the overall idea of restoring China's central position in the world. That's what we're up against. I mean, space is one domain of this idea of essentially moving China to center stage, displacing and dismantling the US-led order. And we haven't seen this kind of contest maybe since the early Cold War, when the USSR was really sort of in its sort of fittest state, so to speak. So we're up against something that's much more effective, much more efficient than the Soviet Union, much larger than Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. And they see this as a piece of an entire structure of pretty much every facet of human activity that has any strategic value. And just to pull something out of the recent 20th Party Congress, I mean, from Xi Jinping, he says, "We have witnessed major successes on multiple fronts, including manned spaceflight, lunar and Martian exploration, deep sea and deep earth probes, supercomputers, satellite navigation, quantum information, nuclear power technology, airliner manufacturing, and biomedicine." So it's one of different industries and technologies, which they call the emerging strategic industries and technologies. And they see that as a suite that leads ultimately to superiority in Communist Party power. So we really need to look at it in the whole context. And at the same time, we have to understand that it's going to, there's going to be a kind of geography to space that Namrata in her book, which I'm a huge fan of, compares space exploration to the voyages of sort of, Christopher Columbus and others, and that's been done. But, we're living in this thing where again, we have to unlock something new. They know that. Their own lunar, mission leaders have already compared the moon and Mars to to islands claimed by China in the East and South China Sea. So they have a deep sense of what they intend to do on Earth's geography. And now they are also looking to space for that. So I think we need timelines that we can execute on, and we need to accelerate this mission and, quite simply beat them. That's what the new space race is. It's the fact that it's something that exists with real timeframes that we have to simply get there first. And their partnership with Russia, which no one should have any doubt about the significance of that. I mean, they've been supporters of Putin's invasion. Chinese and Russian nuclear bombers exercised in Asia during Biden's visit to Quad countries in Tokyo. So quite a deep relationship there. That's not going away. So we're up against Russia and China in this, and they bring different capabilities here and different sort of historic advantages. So it's going to be quite a thing. And we should look at it in its context, understand its importance to our adversary. And then we should also be comprehensive in terms of how we view the potential of space for all of our technology and industry.
Yeah, it's important for our viewers to not misunderstand the nature of this competition. And Nami has said this before in different forums, but it's worth reiterating now. Don't think this is going to be like the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Even at the height of their power, they didn't even reach close to 30% of our gross domestic product. So they were literally weaklings compared to the American economic might. But right now, when you take a look at full economic throw weight, even though China may be the #2 economy in the world, they have more throw weight than America because they don't have a yearly budget that Congress has to approve, and they don't have the balance of power that makes it hard for America to focus money and vision after a goal like China can. So we need to understand this is a totally different game. America has never encountered anything this aggressive, and we better be on our game when it comes to competitive advantage and making strategic investments, or we are going to lose this fight.
If I may add something further, I mean, to go along with that, General Kwast. I mean, absolutely right. When I was writing China's Vision of Victory, I had to revise upwards the percentage of the Chinese economy, from my first draft to my final draft, because it was just growing and gaining on us. And that's still true, whatever people say after this party Congress. I mean, it's still a growing economy. But, the way that they do this, it's through their corporations, the state-owned and state-backed corporations. So this is something that, as our private space sector burgeons, and that's been probably the most important thing that's happened on the US side in quite some time, our companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and others are up against major sort of Chinese megaliths, state-owned enterprises that have an infinite line of capital going into them, that have the entire resources of the state. An interview here with some of the leaders of the Chinese lunar exploration program points out, which Chinese companies are involved in that. It mentions that I think 1,000 units, it says, are contributing to this program. But then it highlights, 3 here, which are the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, then China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, all of which are military corporations. I mean, these are the companies that build Chinese military aerospace. So the other side of this is not on their side, peaceful exploration. I mean, this is the Chinese military going to the moon. This same interview includes, the declaration of intent to establish a base research center at the South Pole for the sake of water and other, water ice and other benefits. But it's China's military companies that are going to lead this. So we're in a military space competition, whether we like it or not. And our private sector is going to be up against companies that have very, very different rules and objectives and support than we do. So we have to understand the systems competition that we're in is one where I think we'll have innovation advantages, but they'll have certain advantages in capital and planning that we need to be able to surpass as well.
And I'll just add on top of that, if you ask the question, why go out into deep space? Why go to cislunar space? Because the Chinese are there. And space people that I've been talking to in DC that just a few years ago were saying, and some of them still are, that we don't need to worry about cislunar space for another 20, 30 years. Well, the Chinese are planning in the next couple of years to build navigation and timing, SATCOM kind of stuff around the moon. They already have a comm relay in L2, which is a Lagrange point on the far side. And a lot of that is like, oh, big deal. Well, there are a lot of applications that can be used from that besides exploration. And to John and Steve's point, there are military applications of this. So this is not the same as the Soviet Union. They may have demonstrated some capabilities back in the Cold War, but the Chinese have the plan and the strategy and the will and the capital to make them reality. And they have a good track record of keeping on their plans within a year or two of when they plan to do so. So something to keep in mind.
And they have our capital too. I mean, that's part of one of the bigger pieces of the contest is that we're still mainlining hundreds of billions of dollars into the Chinese economy. And that does, flow into companies that are deeply tied to the Chinese state.
Well, thank you, everyone. Oh,
Josh,
yes,
if I-
yes, Nami, last thought.
Yeah, just quickly, because after listening to, and especially Chris, when he made the point that they meet their timelines. So that's something I think when you think about the comparative assessment, one of the ways that they are able to showcase to the world, because this is a competition, not just with the United States, but also to attract partners, right? Through the Belt and Road Spatial Information Corridor. So one way countries are really impressed with China and joining into the BRI is the fact that they're meeting their goals and their deadlines. We think that's not important, but for messaging, strategic messaging purposes, if you read public policy, that's critical. And that's what China is doing. And I'll finally end by saying that one way that you can empirically, again, showcase that space is becoming a very critical part of China's thinking is that in the current reconfiguration of the Politburo, you have 2 space scientists that have been included among the 9 members. And then among the 200 central committee members, about 25 of them are space scientists and rocket scientists, and also those who are from science and technology, which is a very new phenomenon for China. And so you can see that they are upgrading science and technology and space to the level of critical infrastructure, which I don't think the US has successfully done as yet. And that could also lead to a disadvantage.
Well, so the next question that we were going to discuss was going to be China's goals in space and why we should be concerned about them. I think we've kind of already hit on that, but asking that specific question, is there anything that anyone on the panel would like to add to that particular question? We've already kind of expanded on the fact that we're facing a military, really a military that is actively going to the moon. A lot of people know for the United States, for instance, that Neil Armstrong was chosen to be the first man on the moon specifically because he did not have that same military background. Buzz Aldrin did, and he was the second specifically for that reason, because NASA wanted to set a good standard of peaceful exploration, and that does not appear to be China's goals based on the discussions we've already had. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add to the previous discussion that we've had so far?
Orson, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I was waiting for the little yellow bar to go around my face. What concerns me from a historical perspective is we may have already lost this competition because their decision-making process is way quicker than ours. Doesn't mean they make better decisions, but it does mean they make them. And I can imagine the political wrestling that would have to go on for us to start funding something as massive as a base on the moon or as a defense system in space against other space-based attacks. It's just, I try to imagine who in Congress would champion it. We're the United States, which means we don't start getting ready until it's too late. Only now, too late is not, like it was in World War II, where we still had time in our isolated North American location to recover and rearm. There'll be no such time. Once they have deployed offensive weapons in space, they have the high ground, and we can't really take it back very easily without having to do Herculean efforts that would cost way more than trying to do it now. So we're bad at anticipating the future. Fortunately, our commercial wing is better, but they aren't planning on how to exploit the military uses of space. And so I just worry that the acquisitions process, that the decision to appropriate money for what we need is going to come down to why don't we take care of the problems here on Earth instead of spending it all in space, which is asinine, it always has been. But it's also constantly brought up among civilians. And then the additional problem that there are going to be people who regard the idea of space conflict as unthinkable. And those people have a voting bloc and are able to have influence in Congress. So we are not an efficient decision-making and forward-thinking system here. We do a lot of good second guessing after, but not before.
Yeah, so to put a point on that, because that's a great comment. They are culturally strategic. They are playing our own attributes against us. And by 2049, they want to have so insidiously strangulated the American economy and set the stage for a cislunar control and dominant maneuver environment that America goes out with a whimper, that they win without having to fire a shot. And they're using our open culture and our trusting society as weapons against us. This is an information warfare as much as it is an economic and a technical warfare. And in the information domain, they are trying to put America to sleep and lull us to a sense of complacency until it's over without firing a shot. That's really important for us to understand.
And I'll just add on top of Orson and Steve's comments there, is one of the things that concerns me from my perch in DC is that the current political leadership, regardless of what branch they're in, are pursuing things that might have been good 20, 30 years ago, such as, norms of behavior, test ban treaties, things that essentially, while good in and of themselves, essentially cede the initiative to the other side because they're not party to those. They really have no desire to be party to those. And any of those arms control or related things that they promote are usually designed with very difficult ways to measure them and to make sure that they're actually accurate. So I think in addition to not making good decisions, we have a tendency since at least the end of World War II of ceding the initiative so that we're not perceived as an aggressor. But this action has already started, like I mentioned before, like everyone's mentioned on this panel before. And I think we need to stop trying to pretend that it's a future problem when it's a now problem.
And I think we haven't lost yet. We really haven't. I mean, what we've lost is a long period of being able to get ahead of these sorts of things. But I think America is going through a substantial national awakening on this issue, and so are many of our allies. And one of the key things that we have to remember is that the US alliance system alone is 50% of world GDP, and I think about 65% of global wealth. So once we go through the economic side of US-China competition, which will require a form of economic containment, cutting them off from the key inputs of the major centers of the world economy, we're just going to have to get that done. Then their game changes quite a bit. I mean, they can't really do all of this space or anything else on the menu without having full-on market access, technology access, and access to capital markets from the wider world. So, they're able to play the card of market access to China, and they've played that for hundreds of years, but we can play ultimately, if we do our if we do this right, the card of access to the global economy. That's still American-led, it's still allied, it's still democratic. The vast bulk of it is there. Then this swings into the emerging world where we have to win other contests. But ultimately, it's still possible to put a stop to the economic and geopolitical rise of China, to put barriers on it, and ultimately to retake the initiative in all this. It happens in the economic arena, and that all has to be translated to space. But I think once we start to win the broader structure, and this has a great deal to do with our private sector, our investment tendencies, our engagement with China, which at this point really, just has to be pulled back. We have a giant capacity in the future, but we do have to regain the lost time. To the point that was made earlier. Not only could we wait, and we tend to, until some kind of attack on us has been made in our history, whether Pearl Harbor or otherwise. We were 3 times the industrial power of both Germany and Japan when that happened, and we had been 10 times the industrial power of Japan in the prior decades. So we're not in that position today, but our alliance system is far superior. And if we're able to bring India to our side and gradually do this with other major nations, the preponderance of power is still in the free world. But we have to be smart, and we have to be better decision makers. That's absolutely true. This requires leadership, and not just in Congress. I mean, we have to have a whole of America approach. It goes way beyond Washington and well into our private sector. And we ultimately have to have this country and all of our allies on a similar page about what this contest requires.
Yeah, and Josh, to answer your question as to should we be concerned about the military developments in space from China, right? I think yes, because I think what General Kwast said is really important, that how are they actually undermining the American leadership in the world, including military responses to, for example, rebuilding artificial islands in the South China Sea, being aggressive in Taiwan, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? One way the Chinese have succeeded in this asymmetric capability, as they say, is to undermine American confidence in response mechanisms, because they have showcased their anti-satellite weapon, their laser, their missile technology. And so what happens is that, and also they have their own independent radio navigation system now. So how has this played out? One is that when China went ahead and built artificial islands in the South China Sea, the US and other allied nations were not able to respond because of the fact that China had that capability to threaten, right? And also, don't forget, they are a nuclear weapon state. And if you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the very fact that President Putin went to meet President Xi just before the invasion happened tells you that there was implicit support from China. And I argue that if China had not shown that implicit support, Putin would have hesitated, right? And then the final contention, which we really need to think of when you think about military application of space power, is that recently China has funded studies through the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, where they have articulated and argued a strategic priority of looking at American private space companies as a threat to their national security, including SpaceX Starlink, Maxar. And they argue that a very similar situation can repeat itself, for example, if China is to take over Taiwan, that Starlink or Maxar or some other company that is US-based will collaborate with the US military to come to the support of national security and American deployment of their military power. And so they have actually identified counter space weapons and capability to limit that influence. So I don't think that has been recognized as yet as a very critical development in Chinese military thinking on space as well, including the US private sector in counter response. So those I think we should be concerned about.
Thank you all. As we're getting near the end of our time, we're going to combine the fourth and fifth questions we had planned. So we're going to discuss for this last section, and then we're going to get to closing statements. But what is the United States doing in space, and what else do you think we should be doing? Whether that's doing something different or doing something more. Nami, would you like to start us off, please?
I was hoping the others would do, but anyway, so so I think what the US really needs from a grand strategic perspective is to make very clear to the American electorate why the US is actually so interested in space, right? Both civilian and military capability. I don't think that articulation is happening. And I talk to so many different conferences, school students, university, and I don't see that kind of grand strategic posturing, which Jonathan's talking about, right? For example, the US still has an advantage, but then if you don't know what you're competing against, you might not have that grand strategic vision. I think second, the United States also need to prioritize space to a critical infrastructure. I know some of my colleagues have talked about it, but I think space is so critical to everything the US does, including military deployment of forces. So that's something the United States really need to do. Finally, I think the US really needs to have a map of cislunar space and space resources. I don't think that is at all in the national imagination like it is for China. For example, China is the only country that has a state-funded program of space-based solar power, right? The US is nowhere there. So if you are not competing with concepts that China is putting out, or for influencing the general understanding of space internationally, you might be seen as doing just traditional space ventures, like going back to the moon to send humans again. So I think those are the things that the United States really need to do, and today.
In World War II, we entered the war out of the tail end of the Great Depression and focused our entire economy on preparing to defeat both of the major enemies. And so we geared up to use all of our economic power. There's not a chance of that happening now without shots having been fired. In fact, what we're actually doing is dismantling our economy bit by bit. The recession we're in now is entirely government caused. And the fact that we have large constituencies that want American power to be curbed, who are in America, and large constituencies that are placing higher priorities on things that will not pay off for 300 years, if then, instead of trying to gear up to compete against an economy that is not limited by the Kyoto protocols, that is using energy however it wants, and without a thought of carbon, as far as I've heard. And we are trying to do this with our feet in manacles. Well, I guess they wouldn't be manacles then, whatever they're called. And we really will have to wake up the public to the need before they will insist on their government not paying attention to fringe groups and gear up the main American economy to prepare for conflict in space.
I think what I would add is we need something like a national business plan for space. I mean, something that's got a very clear time frame and then clear capital requirements. I mean, I'd love to see what it actually costs. Like, what's the CapEx? What's the OpEx? How do we do essentially a 20-year look at the four corners of the problem? And what's pretty much everything we would want to achieve in the next 2 decades? And how do we then accelerate that? And how can we use capital to do this? Because we still have a capital advantage over our adversaries. I mean, that was one of the actual results of the US-China engagement period, was the amount of wealth that was created by us moving into finance and technology and out of manufacturing. We need manufacturing back, but we do have, $126 trillion in net national wealth. You add the alliance system to that, and it's quite the bulk of the economy. So if we can figure out what it costs and learn how to execute, we'll get there faster.
I just want to add, I agree 100% with the point that Nemi made about critical infrastructure. I've long argued that space is not just a part of critical infrastructure, but it's critical infrastructure in its own right, especially GPS. If you look at how China is using their PNT system, Beidou, they're using it as sort of a tool set to make the BRI states bound to Beijing by requiring all of their projects, their economic building projects, to be linked to that timing signal that's controlled out of their control center. In addition to that, I think in order to maintain or to sustain any advantage we have, or to even get to space superiority, which we don't really have the ability to have right now because we've been focusing space so much on terrestrial support functions, that we need a space force that is actually capable of being an armed service that can actually protect and defend not only the things that we've had forever, but the stuff that's expanding. If we're going to be able to protect our interests in cislunar space and even beyond, we're going to have the ability, the capability and the capacity to do so. Right now, the Space Force is way too small. 3% or less of the entire DoD budget is spent on Space Force, yet the DoD is pushing for this joint all-domain command and control and everything else that's going to be almost 90+% dependent on space-related assets, including the tracking layer and the transport communications, things of that sort. So we're essentially creating for ourselves an Achilles heel, even more so than it already is, which is what the Chinese view our space capabilities as a key center of gravity to be exploited, and they're doing a good job at it. I'll also add that the declassification system needs to be fixed or pursued, I should say, in order for the civilian public to understand the situation is going on right now. So the fact that I think General Thompson, who's the Vice Chief of Space Operations, mentioned several months ago now, that we are essentially attacked daily. And the attacks may not be a kinetic missile shot, but we are being hit in more reversible stuff, whether it's laser, high energy, type of jamming, things of that sort. And we are seeing that happen day to day, and that's going to only continue to increase. Cislunar space can be leveraged for various military advantages, some of which, I can't get into in this forum, but I will just say that there are a lot of advantages to be had from leveraging deep space. And so I think if we're going to get to this kind of future that John and others have talked about, we need to raise the flag that this is a now problem. It's only going to get worse if we just continue to sit back and try to deal with yesterday's issues. We have to think boldly and have a strategy that we'll actually get to, and that won't be continuously changed every 2 years to, I believe it was General Kwast's point of the budget. So we need to be able to fund that. In fact, one last thing I'll mention on budget, the Space Force's budget for a lot of the counter space and other issues that other things that we need, don't even have a president's budget request beyond in the out years. So every budget has a 5-year plan, or supposed to, and everything sort of trails off after about FY 24, 25. And Congress knows this. They sent a nastygram back to them saying, what the heck? But in order for the public to really understand this, we have to be more vocal. We have to educate them about the seriousness of this, and that just as it was 100 years ago with sea power, it's very important that we understand cislunar space is going to be no different, and it will impact their lives on Earth. So I'll just leave it at that.
So Joshua, I know we're out of time, but there's one comment that has to be made here that encapsulates all of this, because you can be overwhelmed by the 1,000 things that need to be done. A nation without a vision will perish. And China has a vision, we do not. This has to be at the national level. It has to inspire the American people. And that will congregate all our entrepreneurs around that vision. And we will solve these 1,000 problems with the innovators in America. That's the only way we're going to do this, with our political system and with our culture. And we don't have a vision that's big enough to solve the problem.
I think that's a great spot to leave it at. I think we're unfortunately out of time. I mean, I wish we could have had at least another 30 minutes or so on this. Yeah, 2 hours at least.
Next time.
Hey, that sounds good.
Yeah,
we'll fill it up. Don't worry.
Thank you, Jack. Oh, I could build an entire day around this. I want you to know that, and I would love to do that. And the last 2 points that made, Orson Scott Card made a point earlier about will and focus, et cetera, in our society. General Kwast, your point at the end, that you can be overwhelmed by the tens of thousands of things that need to be done in order for us to succeed. But what we do need is a country with a will and with a focus and an understanding. We're very much like that frog in the water. The water's getting hotter and hotter. It's actually boiling, and we don't even know it, right? And I don't know what that seminal moment is, what that moment is going to be, what that trigger is going to be for us to galvanize around this and become focused in a way that enables us to compete with China. But it is people like you that have this, have the knowledge and the gravitas, et cetera, pushing this point. All we can do is make people aware of it and give you guys a voice, and I hope you'll continue to do that, because this is an existential threat to the United States and the world and our way of life. And if we do not get ahead of this, if we don't catch up, because we are in fact behind, in my opinion, having talked to hundreds of folks like you who are smarter than me, if we don't figure out a way to catch up, it's going to be too late. It's kind of like that Austin real estate market where you thought you were going to buy the house, but it's gone now, and I'm sorry you can't buy it. It's just too late, right? So thank you so much. Joshua, thank you for putting this together. And you guys are going to continue this conversation. And I hope perhaps that Mr. Card and you will continue this theme and maybe come up with a way, as Nami has said, to focus how does America get the knowledge, et cetera, and understand the mind of the Chinese and figure out a way to compete with that. So I'll thank everyone else, and we'll leave Orson, Scott Card, and Joshua to continue the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
So actually, finishing real quick. So I know Nami, I've heard Nami, I've heard Steve, I've heard other people talk about this and talking about the importance of vision at this moment in time. I think it would be an appropriate capstone. We talk about 1492 and Columbus and all of this stuff, that the Europeans sailed across the Atlantic and began a new period of exploration and expansion. What's really interesting is we often don't talk about the other nation that was also in the process of doing a lot of that same expansion about the same time, right around the 1420s or 30s. The Chinese actually had a treasure fleet that they were sailing under Admiral Zhang. They reached at least the African coast, because we have certain villages in Africa that have extensive amounts of Chinese DNA because of the sailors that shipwrecked there. But the Chinese didn't have a vision for why they should engage in this expensive and culturally disruptive expansion into the greater world through sea power. And so instead they turned inward and they burned their ships. And because they did that, you couldn't have seen it necessarily in 1492, you couldn't have seen it probably in 1530, but rolling around to about 1820, 1830 at the start of the Opium Wars, suddenly you had European powers arriving and they dominated the world system by that point. And China didn't really have an option, unfortunately. And China has never forgotten that. They call the next 100 years between about 1849 to 1949, the 100 years of humiliation. And having talked with NAMI and Jonathan and a couple of others, I believe that that is among the cultural grievances that drives them to this current space expansion. And this is the nation that we are up against. They know what happens if they don't expand. They know the side effects of it. They have no intention of experiencing those again. And I think that the United States can beat them, but we need to get ourselves in gear, because it's a deadly serious struggle, not for us and for our children and for our children beyond them as well.